Welcome back to the afternoon session. I hope lunch was sufficient and was good. We're now going to move on to our next session. Kindly switch off your cell phones, else put them on silent mode. We now have a special lecture, How the Sangh Parivar Rewrites History. And the person to deliver this lecture today is Professor K.M. Shrimali. He was a professor of ancient Indian history at Delhi University, has written extensively on myths and historical facts in Indian history. Pertinently, Professor Shrimali has been at the forefront of the struggle against saffronization of Indian history. I'd like to invite Professor Shrimali on stage. The session will be chaired by Kumar Ketkar. He is editor of Divya Marathi, earlier chief editor of Lok Satta. He is a veritable public intellectual in Maharashtra, known to be a voice of reason in times of fear. I invite Professor Shrimali to begin his lecture.
Good afternoon. I know the perils involved in speaking in the post-lunch session, and more so after such a sumptuous and delicious lunch. Since we are celebrating freedom, I'm not going to deny you having freedom to have your afternoon siesta. I can assure you that in enjoying that freedom, you will not miss anything. I have titled my presentation, Putting the Clock Back, Rewriting Ancient Indian History, the Sangh Parivar way. Ancient is put down here in the title largely because that has been an area of my specialization. But I would certainly go beyond that and try to take cognizance of the entire gamut of Indian history. I also take this opportunity as a call to define what I would call parameters of historians' dharma. Almost 50 years ago, the Education Commission report under the chairmanship of Professor D.S. Kothari, the report was submitted in 1966, and I quote from there, "History teaching should aim at training students to think historically, to apply historical method of inquiry to the new problems, to understand, reevaluate, and reinterpret the past. History offers to a greater degree than any other subject an opportunity for the study of human personality and fosters a sense of human responsibility." Unquote. A year later, in 1967, the Bombay High Court delivered a very significant judgment in a case called Ananda Janardhan Karandikar versus the state. And one of the observations mentioned therein said, and I quote, "It is the right and privilege of every thinker to express his judgment on historical events in a fearless manner. To rewrite the history according to the views which are popular or which are necessary for bolstering up nationalistic egoism or jingoism is perversion of history." Unquote. Well, that's a point where I think I need to bring in what I call historians' dharma. I would like to define by juxtaposing myself to the Vedic versus the non-Vedic. In the Vedic, very often we get to hear about Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. The truth is one, and the wise men call it differently, by different names. Those of you who are familiar with some rudimentary elements of the Jaina system would like to think otherwise, since the Jainas tend to focus on Syadvad, the multiplicity, and more than multiplicity, the infiniteness of truth. And that's the reason why historians have often been taking this to their hearts, and as part of their responsibility as a professional historian, have tried to talk about multiple voices which lie under any historical development. There's another aspect of this historian's dharma, of which I'm very fond of, that is what the Buddha called Atta Deepo Bhava. Be a lamp unto yourself. The reason why I'm inclined to put emphasis on this in the present context is because Mr. Modi, a couple of months ago, tried to give a very twisted meaning to it. That's not very unusual to expect from him. He has been doing that rather too frequently. He called it these three-word expression, Atta Deepo Bhav. He called it the shortest and most skillful depiction of scale of management. Well, let me remind you that these three words come after a very, very long passage in a Buddhist text where Buddha is trying to work out the notion of the development of scientific temper. He's saying that don't accept anything as the truth or gospel truth just because you are being told that such and such thing has been put down in the Shastras, or such and such point of view has been given to you by your seniors, by your elders, by your parents, by your teachers, and so on and so forth. Examine everything yourself. And it is only after your own evaluation that you should try to determine the veracity of any particular statement. Nothing is beyond the realm of investigation. Nothing is sacred. You need to question even the sacred. Atta Deepo Bhava. Be a lamp unto yourself. Don't be guided by anyone. Don't be herded by anyone. Trek out your own route yourself. This kind of understanding about the role of reason and scientific temper, I think lies at the very root of the discipline to which I belong, history and history writing. For me, history is a discipline of reason. You should have faith in yourself in what you write, rather than writing on anything with your own faith in your mind. That's not the way in which a historian would like to conduct himself or herself. We are in times where we have the tragic ends of rationalists like the Holkar, Pansari, and Kalburgi. And on the other extreme, we have our Narendra Modis, who try to find evidences of plastic surgery and genetic sciences in our epics. It's not just Narendra Modis. There are many other people who claim to be historians, who venture to speak on domains of historians and take not very dissimilar view. It's here that I would like to recount a couple of developments which I found to be particularly disconcerting. The appointment of the chairman of the Indian Council of Historical Research in 2014, immediately after the installation of Modi's government. He was amongst the perhaps the earliest beneficiaries of that installation. He gave an interview to Economic Times, and that's where he outlined his own vision of history writing and went gaga about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, etc., saying that since we have these epics, why should we need history? That kind of orientation. And that immediately took me back to much earlier days when the first NDA government had come into being in 1990-2000. I remember working in the library of the Indian Council of Historical Research, and some gentlemen in saffron robes came in the library, went round the library, and then met the librarian there, exhorting him in the following words. I'm very happy that you have in your library the Vedas and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and so on, but when you have all these, why have other books in this library? That's not the end of it. When this chairman, Sudarshan Rao, took control of ICHR, the first thing that he did, the first official engagement that he arranged, was to request Professor S.N. Bal Gangadhar, not a historian, I have no problems in that. People from other disciplines can also contribute to insights in history. I have no problems in as far as his area of specialization is concerned. Though I found it disconcerting that just after his ICHR engagement, 2 or 3 days later on, he also addressed the World Hindu Forum under the auspices of the VHP. This S. Bal Gangadhar from Belgium was invited to deliver the 7th Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Memorial Lecture, which is one of the very prestigious events of the Indian Council of Historical Research. This was in November 2014. And the subject that he chose, the title was, "What do Indians need? A history or the past? A challenge or two to the Indian historians." The crux of that lecture also was very similar to what the chairman had said in his interview to the Economic Times, that when you have such wonderful works as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, why do you need history? You can understand your past by going through the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. He also said the subject of history is a fetish. Epics are enough to understand our past. Now, this is just one kind of manifestation of the way in which Sangh Parivar's vision of Indian history writing is fall apart. I think we will have to delve slightly deeper into this problem and not just confine ourselves to the steps that have been taken in the last couple of years. After all, we know that the birth of RSS and its other members of its Parivar go much deeper in our chronology. And we, the professional historians, have faced music of this nature on several other occasions, whenever such forces have come to power, they have tried to implement the ideology of the RSS. And that starts pretty early in the education of Indian children. I think I can use the word children in plural in the present context. I hope it would not be found all that offensive. That's the Irani's use found. Think of thousands and thousands of Saraswati Shishu Mandirs and the Vidya Bharatis all over the subcontinent. They have reached to farthest areas, even in Northeast now. And it is there that the battle is being fought and the mind is being molded. Many of us have tried to dissect and analyze in their utmost minutiae the kind of texts which are used in these schools, right from primary down to secondary and senior secondary levels. The so-called Sanskriti Gyan series and the Gaurav Gathas, etc., etc. I'll come to the examples of some of them a little later. But my basic submission in this context is that notwithstanding their own notions of nationalism, which most of us try to find to be full of problems, they claim to be unleashing what they have called cultural nationalism, as distinct from secularism, because secularism they describe as pseudo-secularism. But they are talking about ultra-nationalism, cultural nationalism. And what is this cultural nationalism resting upon? What are the ingredients thereof? I remember very distinctly when Vajpayee's government came to power in 1999, Murli Manohar Joshi was the Human Resource Development Minister. And he is known to have said that historians like Professor R.S. Sharma, Professor Irfan Nabi, Professor Ramila Thabar, Professor Satish Chandra, etc., lumping all of them in one basket as Marxist historians, that they are terrorists. They are anti-nationals. They are anti-nationals because they write history with an ideology in mind which is not indigenous ideology. The idea comes from outside India. And they are not comfortable with the glorious India's past, the past of the Hindus. For them, it is the period of ancient India which has been the most glorious period. Now, it is this kind of assessment which they are seeing as cultural nationalist assessment. Ironically, this is the one which is rooted very specifically in the kind of history writing that the colonialists and the imperialists did. And that's the reason why I have titled my presentation as Putting the Clock Back. Most of these books, textbooks which are being used in these schools, an educational apparatus network, they are trying to follow the ideas which were laid down by the British imperialist, colonialist, administrative historians in the late 19th and the 20th centuries. I'll give you a few examples of the fundamental postulates of that historiography. One, of course, is the famous communal periodization, which Mill propagated through his book in the early 19th century as the Hindu period, Muslim period, and when it comes to the British, it's not a Christian period, it becomes the British period. So you can see the implications of what the British were trying to do, dividing the Indians into different communities based on the religions of the rulers of respective periods. This is one element. Second is, most of these colonial historians try to think of Indian society as a static society, unchanging society. Right from the Vedic period down to the modern times, there are no changes in the society taking place. Then focusing on the so-called spiritualism of Indians, that the Indians are not concerned with their material interests, they are all the time thinking about otherworldly concerns, they are metaphysical, they are spiritual in their orientation, and so on and so forth. And that the Indians lacked historical consciousness. These are some of the fundamental postulates of the colonialist, imperialist historiography of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. We must ask ourselves a question. The Sangh Parivar vision of history, which calls itself a brand of cultural nationalism, do they question any of these assumptions of the colonialist, imperialist historiographers? They are accusing the Marxist historians to be anti-nationals and terrorists. But what about they themselves? I dare say that neither the so-called nationalist historians of the early 20th century, people like K.P. Jaiswal or R.C. Majumdar and others, neither these historians of the early 20th century nor the cultural nationalists that I have been referring to, nor even the more contemporary and more recent neo-imperialist writers like Andre Wink or Conrad Ernst, have questioned the fundamental postulates of the colonialist imperialist historiography. They are still thinking in terms of communal periodization. They are still talking about Indian society being static. They are still talking about the glories of ancient India. They are still talking about Indians being essentially spiritual in their core, etc., etc. Now that indeed is the outlaying of the parameters of history writing. Then surely it becomes incumbent upon us to figure out what kind of Indian history is going to emerge from their base. And it is here that we need to direct our attention to some of the obsessions with which these historians, or I would much rather prefer to call them pracharikas, have been functioning. Let me try to put things in perspective. I'm sure enlightened audience such as this would be very familiar with the name of Max Muller. And he wrote a very small book in 1882. It is called India, What Can It Teach Us? With a question mark. And this is a collection of 7 essays that he delivered in Cambridge, and essays were meant for those people who were aspiring to enter into civil services to serve the British Empire. Ironically, these are the essays which are lapped up by communal historians. I'll read 3 extracts from this book, India, What Can It Teach Us?, published in 1882, and it was recently reprinted a couple of years ago. I'm quoting Max Muller. I'm not pleading here for Gones or Beals or Santhals and other non-Aryan tribes. I am speaking of the Aryans and more or less civilized inhabitants of India. Anyone other than the Aryans, the tribals, were uncivilized people. Second, my interest lies altogether with the people of India when left to themselves. When left to themselves is put in emphasis. And historically, I should like to draw a line after the year 1000 after Christ. When you read the atrocities committed by the Mohammedan conquerors of India from that time to the time when the England stepped in, the wonder to my mind is how any nation could have survived such an inferno. The Muslim invasion is an inferno for Max Muller, and they are the people who have committed a number of atrocities. And finally, I maintain then that for a study of man, or if you like, for a study of Aryan humanity, there is nothing in the world equaling importance with the Vedas. Now what Max Muller is trying to underline in this particular treatise is the communal periodization, that the period before the coming of Islam was very glorious. The epitome of all knowledge is in the Vedas. The Aryans constitute the civilized people. Anybody outside the realm of the Aryans is the realm of the uncivilized, uncultured people, and so on and so forth. To the extent that the language in which the Buddha and Mahavir taught was called vulgar by Max Muller. There is clearly the sense of us and they, as it is implied in the title of the work itself, India, What Can It Teach Us? Us is the Aryans. The Germans, the white British race, and so on and so forth, they are all Aryans. Now, if you try to reflect on these quotes from India, What Can It Teach Us? You can see that the kind of emphasis that the Sangh Parivar historians try to put are not very dissimilar. For them, the Vedas, the Aryans, and all that emanate from them constitutes the Indian culture, the Hindu culture. The two overlap for them. And with the reason, they are all the time interested in pushing back the antiquity of the Vedas, of the Aryans, even trying to focus on the indigenous origin of the Aryans. Mind you, this idea of indigenous origin of the Aryans also is straightaway a lift from the Western people. The theosophists like Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky, they were the people who talked about the Aryans being of indigenous origin. And when the great nationalist Bal Gangadhar Tilak talked about Aryans coming from the Arctic region, Golwalkar came out with the phenomenal theory of the continental shift, saying the architect was originally in India. That's the kind of scientific history that they are trying to talk about. Now, linked up with this is the whole idea of India, which is reflected in the Sangh Parivar type of history. Now, it is here that I would really like to draw your attention to some of the extracts from the writings of people associated with the Parivar, starting with Golwalkar himself. There is a small work of his, Dheya Smriti, and Golwalkar writes there, if you examine closely you will find that Hindu religion is the only one which can be called religion. Dharma. The others are not religions at all. Not very different from that is the expression which Sitaram Goyal, I hate to say that he is a historian, he writes in a monograph entitled The Emerging National Vision, calling secularism as another name of Deshdroh or Rashtrahdroh, or sedition as we know it now. He says, and I quote, "It is a mistake to accept Islam as a religion. And this mistake is at the root of all other mistakes. We have to proclaim from our rooftops that we do not recognize Christianity and Islam as religions." Just incidentally, may I draw your attention to a very recent development a few weeks ago in the University of California, the Irvine campus. Some of the VHP-inspired Dharma foundations wanted to endow 4 chairs for religious studies in that university. And those chairs were for what they called Indic religions. Zoroastrianism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism were out of that domain of Indic religions. It's not just the endowment of the chairs for these studies. The more important thing is those foundations insisted that people who would be appointed on these chairs would be from the panel that we are preparing and we are giving to you. And they also gave them the list of people who ought not to be appointed. I have not seen the list, but my guess is people like Wendy Doniger would not be on that list. There was an international campaign against such a proposal, and various academics wrote to University of California saying this is very dangerous precedent. Fortunately, University of California has declined to accept that endowment. But that gives you an idea of the kind of forces that are at work both nationally and internationally to bring about changes in history writing. The idea of India to which I was referring to is clearly based on the notion which was once proclaimed by Hitler's Germany. One nation, one people, one language, one culture. In 1998 manifesto of the BJP, we read, and I quote, "Our nationalist vision is not merely bound by the geographical or political identity of Bharat, but it is referred to our timeless cultural heritage. This cultural heritage, which is central to all regions, religions, and languages, is a civilizational identity and constitute cultural nationalism of India, which is the core of Hindutva." In 1998 itself, when Advani was the Home Minister, there was a Buddha Mahotsav arranged in Sarnath, the place where the Buddha delivered his first sermon after his enlightenment. And that was a function which was attended by a large number of Buddhists from Southeast Asian countries, Burma, Thailand, and so on. And it is at that occasion that Advani tried to argue that the Buddhists were not different from the Hindus. This enraged a large number of Buddhists, and they walked out. So this effort to impose a particular identity on people who would otherwise like to identify themselves differently is very much a trait of the thinkers of RSS Parivar. We also remember how they described Sikhs as nothing but Hindus, which was retorted by the people very differently. And they said, गऊ मांस का खाएंगे, मांस गऊ का खाएंगे, हिंदू नहीं अखवाएंगे. We shall eat beef and not let them call ourselves Hindus. Similarly, Advani made another statement while he was still the Home Minister. He went to rename the prison at Port Blair after Savarkar. And he said, today Hindutva is considered an offensive word, but we must remember that the pioneers of Hindutva, like Veer Savarkar and RSS founder Hedgewar, kindled fierce nationalistic spirit that contributed to India's liberation. What kind of nationalist spirit? What kind of nationalism did Savarkar symbolize? Let's try to recall in this context the kind of petition that Savarkar himself wrote to Lord Linlithgow, Viceroy of India, on October 9, 1939. He advocated that the interests of the Hindus and the British were now compellingly one, and that two needed to close ranks to prevent Muslims from making any claim to nationhood. That is the nationalistic spirit that Advani recalls. Murli Manoj Joshi, the HRD minister, Hindu Rashtra is the basic culture of this country. I say that all Muslims are Muhammadiya Hindus and Christians are Christi Hindus. Sudarshan, who took over the charge from Rajju Bhaiya in the RSS, and I quote him, if Muslims have to stay in India, they will have to submit to the Indianization of their religion. And he also spoke of epic war between Hindus and non-Hindus. How different is the message in Javed Akhtar's famous Nazm, दो आवाजें. इस मुल्क में हैं आवाजें दो, एक हमारी और एक उनकी. हम कहते हैं इंसानों में इंसानों का प्यार रहे, वो कहते हैं खून खराबा होता है तो होने दो. This is the idea of India. So whether you are taking the preachings of Golwalkar or the frenzy of Godse or extremism of Advani or even moderation of Vajpayee and sometimes intellectual sophistry of some journalists, the older one like the late Girilal Jain or more modern one like M.J. Akbar. The message is same. There's hardly any difference in the ultimate core. Hate to Muslims. Hatred is the key word for all of them. And some kind of patronizing indulgence towards other minorities. Let's not forget that RSS hostility for 3 M's, Marx, Macaulay, and Muslims, is very integral to their vision of India. I had talked about the books which are being used in Saraswati Mandirs and the Vidya Bharatis, and even in schools of Delhi which come under the CBSE when these people were in power, and how the textbooks were revised by the NCERT. I'll give you an example, couple of examples from these works. The Sanskriti Gyan series and the Gaurav Gathas, the entire world was inhabited by the Hindus in the past. Ashokan inscriptions are in Sanskrit. Anyone who knows even the basics of Indian epigraphy would know that Ashoka used Prakrit in most of his inscriptions, apart from Greek in the northwest. Caste. Varna system was the precious gift of the Aryans to mankind. You don't have to look for gender sensitivity in this formulation. Nowadays, we don't use mankind, we prefer to use humankind. Shudras were not exploited. The Johar, Sati, Parda, they all came into being only because of the arrival of the Muslims. The Kaaba, millions of people go there to worship Shivalinga. People of higher Varna were fair-skinned and the dark-skinned people were Shudras. Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, they were all demonized in these books. I think this kind of vision about idea of India stands in total contrast to the vision of Gandhi, Nehru and Ambedkar. Nehru certainly is the villain for these people. They don't miss their words on count. Gandhi, they are trying to appropriate in a manner which is bordering ridiculous. As soon as Narendra Modi assumed power, the national holiday of Gandhi's birth was abolished. In the name of celebrating that as Swachh Bharat Abhiyan Day, as if Gandhi can be reduced to the cleanliness pride, howsoever welcome that might be. But that was more in the direction of denigrating the idea of India that Gandhi cherished. They are trying to appropriate Patel, they are trying to appropriate Ambedkar without recognizing that the differences between Nehru and Patel or Nehru and Ambedkar and Gandhi and Ambedkar were not as fundamental as they are trying to make, and more importantly, neither Nehru nor Patel nor Ambedkar wanted RSS. Their opposition to RSS was much deeper and deep-rooted than were their differences on other counts. But that's a different story. I think the historian's dharma is that they should be vigilant against myth-making and mythifying history. And I would like to end on a rather humorous note, which I would certainly like you all to take with all seriousness that implies in it. Lucian, the great satirist, while lampooning historians of his time, he belonged to 2nd century AD, had said, and I quote, "Objective history has no favorites and no takers these days. Manipulating history appears to be now the official pastime." Wasn't he being too prophetic? Think about it. Thank you.
We'll take 3 questions and then concluding remarks by the chair. Those who'd like to raise questions, please raise your hands. Identify yourself.
Sujit Paranjapet from Mumbai. I'm a little disturbed that from what you have excellently propounded, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are totally out of the narrative of India from what is transpiring.
Hi sir, my name is Sakib. I'm a PhD student at Tata Institute of Social Sciences.
I'm sorry, you are not audible.
Is it fine now? Hi sir, I'm Sakib. I'm a PhD student at TIS Mumbai. You have brilliantly pointed out how the Sangh Parivar and the historians who identify themselves with this line of thought have not only critique the colonial classification of Indian history, but actually have completely followed that line. I mean, if you see, right from the founding fathers of the Sangh, right from Veer Savarkar to Golwalkar Hedgewar, right down to the recent ICHR chairman. I mean, the chairman did not have any credible writing as such, not even one. I mean, peer review article. Only I think some rudimentary and random blog posts where he refers to a couple of things like he completely agrees with the Mill's classification of Indian history, like he says Hindu, Muslim and the British period. So our Y.S. Rao was equally I mean, he has painted the same picture as Hindu, Muslim, British period, seeing Muslims as temple raiders and things like that. Also things like caste. So just a comment, it's not a question. So sorry.
You are only reiterating what I have said already.
So it has not only have they not critiqued, but they have completely followed till from the founding fathers till current times.
We'll take one question on the balcony. Sorry, excuse me. We're taking one question on the balcony.
My question is, can we demythify the epics so as to counter this Sangha Parivar kind of history?
Yes.
We'll just take one question then.
Hello sir, I'm Sujat. I'm doing my TY Philosophy from Wilson College, Mumbai. My question is, in this Hindu interpretation of history that we have right now, or the Hindutva appropriating Ambedkar or Shivaji, can we process rational thought and we with more strength and a more objective interpretation? I agree there are people, but with more vigorous and with more and to channelize a movement against such patronizing, such right-wing patronizing of history or these figures.
Well, essentially there are three questions. The one on the extreme left was a sort of reiteration of the point that I was making. First about Mohenjo-daro and other thing, Harappa. Well, I didn't go into the details. Well, that's very much at the root of their vision that they are indeed trying to locate establishments, settlements which are comparable to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And more relevant in that context would be the debate about naming of the civilization as Saraswati Hindu civilization rather than Harappan civilization. Lot can be said about that and how they are trying to fabricate evidences to achieve that. One classic example would be the manner in which horse was invented in Harappan seals and how that was exploded by Witzel and Feller in the famous article in the front line. So I didn't go into the details of individual problems. The question about possibility of demythifying epics, well, yes. Historians who have used texts such as these, I wouldn't really like to give credit to Y. Sudarshan Rao for doing that. But certainly he's not the first one to suggest that these epics can be used for historical reconstruction. People of earlier generation too, and right from the time when history was being written, people have made use of these as historical works in some ways and use them critically. The important thing is to assess these works critically and analytically, keeping in view the chronological and the spatial dimensions of these texts, distinguishing between the events and the text. Well, whether Mahabharat war took place or did not take place, if at all it did, when did it take place, where did it take place, and so on. These are all questions which have been debated incessantly by all historians who have made use of these texts for writing of history. So it is possible to really demythify them. I can easily think of a PhD thesis which was produced in the Deccan College, Pune, Mahabharata and the archaeological evidence. So it is possible, provided you have the willingness to undertake a critical and analytical orientation toward these works, rather than to accept these details as straightforward the history, taking myths as the history. That is not a kind of path that I think any historian would like to take. About this need for making a kind of movement, yes, I wish. And that has been some of my grievances, in the sense that the writings that have been done in the last 50 years in trying to question the basic fundamental postulates of the colonialist imperialist writers by people like Romila Thapare, Van Habib and others. I would certainly welcome any movement to take these ideas down to the common people. There is need for that, there is scope for that. The more intensely we do, the better it is. Thank you very much.
Well, actually, after this very eloquent, scholarly and polemical lecture by Professor Shrimali, I am certainly neither competent nor authority on any subject related to history, though I am a student of history. Earlier days, the thinkers and the pundits used to say that it is future which is unpredictable and uncertain. Now, historians have made even history unpredictable and uncertain, and these days we are living through the unpredictable part of history. If any one of you goes to, as you correctly said, the textbooks in Gujarat textbooks, you will notice how the history has radically changed in Gujarat. There is also effort in Maharashtra to change history books. I happen to be on the textbook bureau, and I know what ideological, political and historical struggle one has to go through with other people who are also part of the textbook writing. So I am completely aware of the threat that the new history poses to the new future and to the new present. Coming to Gujarat, it will be totally digressing from the debate here on this subject. But I think it is necessary to bring, because media has completely suppressed it, not completely but almost suppressed it, is Narendra Modi's wife has not been given passport, which is every citizen's right. And the reason why she has not been given passport has in history. The history says that her marital status is not clear, and that's why she has not been given. Now, all of us know that if there is no clear proof of marital status, any gazetted officer or elected representative can give a certificate and you can get your certificate. She has been denied certificate on that count. And imagine some other person in the Nehru Gandhi family, for instance, was to be denied passport. It would have made headlines on Times Now, News Hour. But this particular simple fact has not been even adequately publicized. More because she said, I feel insecure and unsafe in Gujarat. She came to Mumbai in the same Azad Maidan about which Jyoti Purani spoke, and in Azad Maidan she demonstrated and protested. Almost entire media boycotted the event. This is at the level of media changing not only history, but media is supposed to be covering present. Media is also changing the present so that to keep history away and the future unpredictable or predictable according to them. only one point is that, as Mr. Kirannagar correctly said, we are all involved. We are all culprits. Because it is the middle class. I have grown in the middle class family. And in the school I studied, Chembur High School, we did not know anybody's caste or religion in our school. That entire middle class, till almost I would say 1980, even 85, 90, used to be quite secular in its approach. They may not be secular by ideology, but their lifestyle was secular, their thinking was secular. They did not identify anybody as Hindu. And suddenly in the last 25, 30 years, people have started identifying by the religion, by the religious identity. And this change, this transformation in middle class actually begins sometime in 1987 and later on 1989 when the Ayodhya movement picked up and 1992 when the Babri Masjid took place. And since then, in fact, without the Babri Masjid episode, the destruction of Babri Masjid, the Shiv Sena BJP could not have come to power in Maharashtra. It is on that bandwagon of Hindutva that they came to power. The point I am saying is, they came to power from just two seats in 1985 to 182 seats in 1998, almost just a decade later, clearly shows that the middle class had begun to shift. It is the same middle class. It is the same middle class, and now the new middle class post-liberalization, which forms nearly 25%, and many other castes and middle classes in other castes have joined this middle class, and that forms the 31% that voted for Modi. Now that middle class has not yet turned away, and essentially when we discuss all these subjects ideologically, politically, and sociologically, we must understand that this middle class has so radically changed that even if there is, if at all, change in power parties, the ruling parties, fundamentally this middle class will rule and also reign. Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for more than just braving the post-lunch session.